Anyway, new proof today that the group Acorn is responsible for the mortgage mess. Stanley Kurtz is spelling it out in an op-ed. He is a contributing editor for the National Review Online. Where's the proof?
Well, Neil, if you go back into the history, you see that Acorn was really critical as a catalyst starting the whole financial meltdown. The key years are 1990 through 1995. This is when Acorn was using the Community Reinvestment Act to force banks to make these high-risk loans to low-credit customers. They used intimidation tactics, pouring into bank lobbies, breaking into the offices of bankers, and they used that law, the Community Reinvestment Act. And they ran into a roadblock, Neil. The banks would say, hey, you know, we can only make but so many of these high-risk loans because Fannie and Freddie won't take them off our hands. They won't buy them from us. That's when Acorn went to their Democratic friends in Congress, and that's when the pressure really started getting put on Fannie and Freddie to loosen their credit standards.
Now, the argument at the time, Stanley, and this was expressed by some Republicans as well, expand the lending pool so that home ownership becomes almost a birthright, that the pursuit of a home should be for everyone, even those marginally qualified. That was a powerful shift in thinking, was it not?
It was, and it didn't work. I mean, they thought that these credit standards that were so important for years were sort of outdated. A bunch of old fuddy-duddies cared about them. They didn't realize that that was absolutely fundamental, and you couldn't sweep it away without major consequences. It wasn't really, though, until the Clinton administration got in. Whatever few Republicans were in favor of this, for the most part, the Republicans were dragged along kicking and screaming. But when the Clinton administration got in, not only did it work to strengthen CRA, it really swept through the whole banking system, the whole regulatory system, with this notion that, you know, out of fairness, we ought to loosen these standards, and that set the scene for all the trouble we're in right now.
And Stanley, your sense from your investigations is what? That we took what out of the home measurement process? Just basic accounting, right?
Well, yeah, and then there were a lot of different ways in which they undermined the traditional standards. People were allowed to go down to very low down payments. Sometimes they wiped the need for down payments out almost completely. They stopped looking at people's credit history. And what happened with these subprime mortgages and Acorn and all of that started to seep into the whole system. It really did begin a whole new way of thinking about mortgages and lending as a whole. And that's why when people point out, well, look, there's so many of the problem loans weren't these Acorn-influenced subprime loans, but Acorn was kind of the lever that opened up this whole new way of thinking. The Clinton administration bought it and spread it through the whole system.
All right. Stanley Kurtz, thank you very much.
The House Republicans aren't going to go along. We're not going to agree to give $20 billion to left-wing groups. We're not going to agree to all the extra spending.
And I'll tell you another point that I want to bring up here, and that's how much money went to Acorn. People are looking at what immediately just happened. Think about that $300 billion housing bailout that happened this summer. $500 million of that money went to the far left-wing, crazy, radical group Acorn.
Right. We just heard from Eric Shawn about Acorn. It sounds like this is perhaps not the 100% most reputable organization. What would be in the Democrats' interest to give Acorn so much money?
Right. Well, you know, the Democrats are attempting to tell the country a fable in the response to the financial crisis. The fable goes like this. This crisis is the result of 8 years of unbridled, anything-goes capitalism. That was how Nancy Pelosi, among many others, has put it. In fact, if you look at the history of this, what the reality shows is that part of this crisis, in fact, the main part of it, was a result not of capitalism, but of government interference in the market, of Democrats pushing to get people loans who could not afford them, people who were not creditworthy. And who down at the street level was agitating and pushing very hard? Acorn. Acorn had what they call direct action tactics, where they would intimidate banks, because they had the law on their side, the Community Reinvestment Act. Every time Acorn's name comes up, it brings up Mr. Barack Obama, who began his career as an Acorn agitator. He worked closely with Acorn. He was endorsed by Acorn. He trained their workers, the very people who later descended upon local bank offices as Acorn shakers shakedown artists demanding these subprime loans.
Well, the liberal activist group Acorn organizes voting drives across this country. But some say its election activities are not above board. The Consumer Rights League slams Acorn for voter registration fraud and other election abuses. So why would Democrats include money for this group in the bailout bill?
Well, I think it's a problem because when you look at Acorn's structure, they're a massive organization. There are 150 subsidiary organizations with already this year a $110 million budget, and their voter registration activities have spawned investigations in over almost a dozen states. And we're talking about millions of registrations, thousands and tens of thousands of fraudulent registrations, and which is not to even mention that the fact that of that $110 million, a significant portion of this operation is being funded by the taxpayers already. And to put this organization, to earmark money for this organization ahead of the taxpayers is just outrageous.
Why is it described as a liberal activist group? Is it connected officially to the Democrats?
Well, I don't think, they live in a very nuanced world, but I don't think in any official on-paper connection, but I think, you're judged by your actions, and you look at the history of this organization, their relationship with the Democrat Party, their relationship with a lot of the Democrat causes and members of Congress, and I think even if you look at their voter registration drives, I think if you did an analysis of the registrations that they collect, you would see they're overwhelmingly Democrat registration. Acorn Housing Corporation takes a dramatic amount of money from the federal government to help people, ostensibly help poor people get into houses. But one of the things we've seen out of the Acorn Housing Corporation is the very same loan products that they attack and call, what they call predatory, are the very same loan products that they have gone into partnerships with various banks, and we're actually pushing these products on the lower income Americans.
So these
things
bad
like,
mortgages
the
are
zero
what
down.
caused this problem that we're dealing with on Capitol Hill, and now as part of the bailout bill, to solve that problem, lawmakers are considering giving money back to the group that got those problematic mortgages to begin with. Do I have it right?
Absolutely, and I think that these are the kind of things that only can happen in Washington, D.C., because, not only you talk about the modern day practice of this organization, but the roots of this go all the way back to the Community Reinvestment Act and redlining, and, when banks were forced to ignore risk ratios and give loans that they would never have considered. And, to be sure that once the banks figured out how they could make a ton of money on this, everybody went wild with it. But you can see clearly that even throughout all of this, you have where institutions were incentivized to continue to offer more and more and more of these risky loans because they were getting credit from the government throughout all these various regulatory schemes that were in place.
And James, in Acorn's defense, we haven't spoken with them. We haven't gotten a statement from them. We've attempted, but we failed this morning. So we don't have that half of the story. But I assume they deny these charges that you're leveling.
Well, I mean, what they do very often, they will, it's a big shell game. Like I say, they have 150 different subsidiary organizations, and they juggle blame just like they juggle financing. They juggle blame between organizations, and, and particularly on voter fraud, what they'll very often do is they will lay it off to, low-level rogue employees. But the fact of the matter is this is not the first time they've done this. This has been 10 years, 5 election cycles, and that's not a accident, that's a pattern.
One of the worst recent voter scandals happened in Washington State 2 years ago. Voter registration forms for 1,800 people were submitted by the activist organization Acorn. Acorn even threatened to sue election officials there if they didn't accept the registrations. But there was only one problem. Only 6 of the 1,800 names were real people. All the rest were fake. The Acorn workers did admit that they made the names up. As for the Acorn workers, 7 were prosecuted for felony offenses of filing false information. 1 did go to jail. But John Jones, the head of the state's Acorn office, denies the organization was responsible.
We found out that we had a small handful of morons who decided to take it upon themselves to defraud the people of Washington State.
And particularly on voter fraud, what they'll very often do is they will lay it off to, low-level rogue employees. But the fact of the matter is this is not the first time they've done this. This has been 10 years, 5 election cycles, and that's not a accident, that's a pattern.